Okay, so good morning. Today's daf is daf Kuf Chet 108 in Masechet Zevachim. Masechet Zevachim has Kuf Chaf 120 dapim. So we are less than 2 weeks from completion. We are at the bottom of Kuf Zayin Amabet. We are last word on the fourth to last line. Itmar. And we had just cited the dispute between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish about offering sacrifices bisman hazeh, and whether or not that is considered, if you were to offer sacrifices, outside the Beit Hamikdash today, is that are you going to be subject to the liability because you're not doing it in the Beis Hamikdash, or and that's what Rabbi Yochanan says, or are you not subject to the liability because there is no Beis Hamikdash, which is what Reish Lakish says. So that's the last debate that we had, and now we're going to have another debate that is associated or at least related in some way to this debate that we just cited. So Itmar. And I'll note that the Shita Mikubetzes here in Ot Yud Zayin indicates that it should say Hama'aleh Aver, that if you were to offer up a limb, the Ainbo Kazayas, and it doesn't have an olive size to it, the Etzem Mashlimo Lekazayas, and the bone adds to it and brings it to the size of an olive. As Rashi says, etzem ein mitzvah lahaloto im peresh. That when it comes to bones, this is the last Rashi on Daf Kuf Zayin Amabet, that there is no mitzvah to bring those up on the altar and to burn them if they were to be separated. And so, as a result, you can go in either direction. Maybe because it's still connected, it is tashlim, it completes the size of a kazayas, or no, even though it might add volume, because it wasn't necessary to be burned in the first place, it doesn't count. Kida Amran Beperak Hamizbeab Makadesh. So that is earlier on Daf Pei Amud Bet that we saw the fact that you don't need to bring bones of an ola on the altar. And so the question is, do we say that the bone completes the olive size or not? So Rabbi Yochanan Amar Chayiv. Rabbi Yochanan says yes. Reish Lakish Amar Pater. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Chayiv Chibure Olin Ka'olin Dami. That what's connected to the ola is like an ola itself. Reish Lakish Amar Pater. Chibure Olin Lav Ka'olin Damim. No, just because it's connected doesn't mean that it's actually subject to the same rules. So by Rava asks the following question. Hama'ale. Now we turn to Kuf Chet Amud Aleph. Hama'ale Rosh Ben Yona She'ein Bo Kazayas. What happens if you were to burn the head of a pigeon that does not have the size of an olive? And Rashi helps us understand the question. Rosh Yona Shel Olas Ha'of. We're talking about a bird ola. Va'alu b'chutz. And you offered it outside the Beis Hamikdash. Do we say, well, you offered the entire head, and therefore, okay, so, and what's the further qualification? Umelach mashlimo l'kazayas, and the salt, because we need to salt all sacrifices. You need, and Rashi points out that if the salt gets separated and comes off the base, the altar, you need to return it to the altar. So there's some aspect of it that makes it a little bit like a sacrifice. So Mahu, what do we say? So Amrle Rava Miparzakya L'Ravashi. So Rava says, Lav hainu plugtayu to Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish. Isn't this the same argument about that Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish had? After all, in the Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan argument, they discussed a less than a kazayas that is completed through a bone. Here we have less than a kazayas that's completed through salt. Seems like you might have the exact same machlokas. So not necessarily. The Gemara responds, Tiboy le Rabbi Yochanan, v'tiboy le Reish Lakish. Actually, it's a reasonable question, both according to Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Tiboy le Rabbi Yochanan, ad kan lo kama Rabbi Yochanan hasam ela etzem, domina b'davasar who, when it comes to the bone, well, it's one with the meat. It's one thing. It's one animal. Aval melach, Delav mina debar yonahu. But when it comes to the salt, it's not a pigeon. It's not part of the pigeon, just not that you're just a part that you don't have to bring up. So no, so low, so low. Maybe in fact you would not include it in determining the measure, and therefore maybe Rabbi Yochanan, even though he says chayev with respect to the etzem, would say pater with respect to the melach. Tiboy l'Reish Lakish, and it's a question for Reish Lakish because ad kan lo kama Reish Lakish hasam ela de'i parish mina lav mitzvah la'asuke. When it comes to the bone, if the bone were to fly off the altar, there would be no obligation to put it back on the altar. Aval hacha, but here, in connection with the salt, de'i parish mitzvah la'asuke, if it were to fall off, you'd need to put it back on. Low, maybe not. Maybe you would say that there you would be chayiv, odilma loshna, or maybe that's not the distinguishing factor, and therefore you don't know, and teku. The Gemara does not come to a conclusion with respect to this question. So, but in any event, best not to offer sacrifices outside the Beis Hamikdash. Okay, so in our Mishnah, we had Rabbi Yossi Haglili. And Rabbi Yossi Haglili disagreed with the rabbis. And Rabbi Yossi Haglili said that if you in fact sacrifice an animal outside, I mean, if you slaughter the animal, excuse me, outside of the Beis Hamikdash, well, you've already slaughtered it outside the Beis Hamikdash, so it's now no longer kosher as a sacrifice. And therefore, if you were to now try to bring it up as a sacrifice, you would not be liable. And the only situation where you would be liable is if you sacrificed the animal inside the Beis Hamikdash and then brought it outside and then brought it up on the altar. So he does not find liability when you have this slaughtering happening outside the Beis Hamikdash. And the rabbis challenged him because if what you're going to tell me is that you need to have a kosher sacrifice for the bringing of the animal up outside the Beis Hamikdash to be the prohibition to apply, well, as soon as you slaughter the animal and take it outside the Beis Hamikdash, well, now it's no longer kosher, and so you, under your theory, you should no longer be liable for bringing it up outside the Beis Hamikdash, is what the Tanakama and the slash Chachamim are telling Rabbi Yossi Haglili. So what does Rabbi Yossi Haglili answer? So Heishiv Rebbe Tachas Rabbi Yossi Haglili. So Rebbe helped out Rabbi Yossi Haglili, and in this brisa we're going to have his answer. Mala shochet bifnim umala b'chutz. When it comes to slaughtering the animal inside the Beis Hamikdash and then offering it outside, shahaisa lo sha'as hakosher. It had a moment when it could have been put on the altar, and therefore that makes it different from the case where an animal was slaughtered outside the Beis Hamikdash. Tomar b'shochet chutz umala b'chutz. You're going to try and compare that to a situation where it was slaughtered outside and brought outside, shalo haisalo shas hakosher, that had no moment of being fit to go on the altar in the Beis Hamikdash. So as a result, that's response number one to the Chachamim in our Mishnah. And response number two, Heshiv Rebbe Lazar, Rebbe Shimon, Tachas Rebbe Yossi Aglili. Rebbe Lazar also offered an answer, and he said, Ma l'shochet bifnim u'ma lebechutz sheken kodesh mikablo, that when you have something that was slaughtered inside the Beis Hamikdash and then offered outside the Beis Hamikdash, if you were to bring it back into the Beis Hamikdash and put it on the altar, it would be accepted. It would not have to be taken off the altar, even though it was an invalid sacrifice, because after you slaughtered it, you brought it outside of the Beis Hamikdash. So Tomer b'shochet b'chutz she'ein kodesh mekablo, but that's not true if you were to slaughter the animal outside, where if you slaughter the animal outside the Beis Hamikdash and then bring it into the Beis Hamikdash and put it on the altar, the obligation would be to remove it from the altar. And so as a result, that's the difference. So again, the key question for Rebbe is, was there a moment of kashrut? And the key question for Rebbe Lazar is, would the animal stay on the altar if you had put it on the altar, or would you be obligated to remove it? So now that we're going to ask my Benayu, what's the difference between these two opinions? So Amr Zeiri, Shchitas Laila Ika Benayu. The difference is slaughtering at night. If you slaughter at night, let's walk through it. Well, actually, you know what? We can walk through it in Rashi. So Rashi, first of the narrow lines in Rashi, Shchitas Laila Ika Benayu, Li Rebbe, according to Rebbe, Shachat Behema Belaila Bifnim V'Ha'ala B'chutz Patur. If you were to slaughter the animal at night inside the Beis Hamikdash and then bring it outside the Beis Hamikdash and put it on the altar, you would be exempt. Shelo haitala shas hakosher, because that animal could never have been brought onto the altar, even though it was slaughtered inside the Beis Hamikdash, because an animal because it was just not, it's never kosher. De b'shchitasa nifsala, through its shechting at night, it became a pasul korban. However, l'Rabbi Elazar, Chayiv, you would be chayiv according to Rebbe Lazar. Let me just make sure I get this right. Is it Rebbe Lazar or Rebbe Elazar? Yeah, Rebbe Lazar. You would be chayiv according to Rebbe Lazar because shaharei hektish mekablo sheim ala lo yarad. Because if in fact you had put it on the altar, you would not be obligated to take it off. The altar itself would sanctify it and cause it to be holy. Rabba offers a second difference. Kabbalas bekli chol ika. If you were to receive the blood, not in one of the klisha races, not one of the sanctification vessels, but in an unconsecrated vessel, a vessel that was not belonging to the Beis Hamikdash. And again, same basic result. Take a look at the next Rashi. Rabba Amar Kabbalah bekli chol ika benayu shas hakosher leka. Again, Rebbe would say that it's not going, you're not, if you then take this animal and bring it outside the Beis Hamikdash and you offer it as a sacrifice there, it's not going to be liable because it never had a moment that it could be put on the Beis Hamikdash. But Kidesh, but if you were to put it on the altar and thereby sanctify it, mikablo, it would be accepted. So ika de kol shepsula bekodesh hektish mikablo, because any offering that was kosher when it came into the Beis Hamikdash, if you and then became unkosher, if you put it on the altar, it will sanctify it and cause it to be accepted. So now we have two differences between the answers of Rebbe and Rebbe Lazar to the question posed in our Mishnah by the Chachamim against Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Okay, so our Mishnah also said Tamei Sha'ach.
Well, how do we define Shchute Balayla? Now we do have a korban bein arbayim, so that's in the evening. Is that? I mean, when Bein Hashmashot, is that Lila or not Lila? The
So
Korban Tommy Bein Arbayim.
that's a good question. In connection with this, I'm not sure what the answer would be, but the bottom line is that we know that if in fact it's certainly light and you have the three stars out or whatever the definition of night you're going to use, then for sure that korban is going to be puzzle. Yeah, it's also important to note that they would offer the mincha offering. They would not wait until the very end of the day to offer the mincha offering. Indeed, of course, on Pesach they would offer that Tamid ben Arbaim is what I really mean. But they would offer that Tamid ben Arbaim as early as possible. In order to give as much time for the Korban Pesach. So I don't believe that they usually would wait into the Bein Hashmashos time period in order to offer it. But so here we can ignore the possibility of disagreements about what the definition of night is and just say it's night. We're going to go with a nighttime that's according to everybody. Okay. So our Mishnah then had a similar argument between Rabbi Yossi Aglili and the Tanakama and the Chachamim with respect to somebody who is Tameh, who eats food that is somebody who's tahor, excuse me, who eats sacrificial food that is itself tameh. That according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, you're not going to be liable, whereas according to the Chachamim, you would be. And the Chachamim challenged Rabbi Yossi Aglili by saying, hey, when you have a tameh person eats a food that's tahor, he makes it tameh as soon as he touches it. And yet you even agree that in that case he's liable. So how does Rabbi Yossi Aglili respond? And so the Gemara says, Shapir ka'amri le Rabbanan le Rabbi Yossi Aglili. It seems like the rabbis have a great argument. So Amar Rava responds on Rabbi Yossi Aglili's behalf. Kol hecha denitma tumas haguf va'achar kach nitma basar. That if in fact the person became tameh before the meat became tameh, well then dekuli alma lo pligli dechayev. Everybody agrees that you would be liable. Meaning that Rabbi Yossi Haglili is not saying that is highlighting that the order is what matters here. The question is who became tameh first? If it was the meat, I'm sorry, if I mean, the question is, so 1 second. So let's figure out where the argument is. Shekain tumas haguf bekares, because eating a sacrificial when one is tameh is in fact subject to kares. Ki pligi b'shenitma basar v'achar kach nitma haguf, where the meat was already tameh when the person became tameh. So as a result, when the person became tameh, this meat was already not kosher, and therefore not subject to the rules any longer. And so as a result, the Rabbanan Savre Amrinan Migu, that the rabbis say that we say the word since, meaning take a look at Rashi, basically middle of the narrow lines in Rashi. The Rabbanan Savre Amrina Migu v'Isser Kolel Chal al Isser Acher, that we all, yes, it is already prohibited to eat this tameh piece of meat, but when the person becomes tameh, it creates a larger prohibition that also applies to kodesh that has not become tameh. And so as a result, now that we have this Isser Kolel, it can affect the tameh piece of meat as well. And we say, since this person who now became tameh cannot eat a tahor piece of a sacrifice, we're going to say that the prohibition of a Tameh person eating sacrifice will also apply to a Tameh person eating this piece that is already Tameh. Continuing on in Rashi, right? Ve'isur kolo chal al isur acher. Daha amrinan ein isur chal al isur be'isuri de alma kamrinan. That when we say that you don't have one prohibition go on the other, that is in general situations. But here we have a special exception of an isur kolel, of a more general prohibition. And Rabbi Yossi Aglili savar lo amrina migu. We don't say migu, namely that since the prohibition already applies to eating this piece of meat and it's just not subject to kares, so you're not going to be subject to kares. We're not going to apply a different prohibition to it. So that is the machlokas as Rava explains it, and so as a result, the answer the answer to the question by the Chachamim is yeah, actually, if in fact a ta a that when a tame person picks up a piece of tahor meat and contaminates it, of course he's going to be liable because the person was tame before the piece of meat. And so you're absolutely right. I agree with you completely, Rabbanan, but I disagree with you if the order is reversed. If in fact the prohibition already existed on the piece of meat, then the person became tameh, then there's already the prohibition on this piece of meat, and we're not going to add to that prohibition with a new prohibition. Okay? So the Gemara now asks, Rabbi Yossi Aglili, Nihi demigu lo amrina. Does he really not say that because this is a broader prohibition, it's going to also take effect with respect to tame foods? So tesi tumas aguf dechamiri v'tachol al tumas basar. It should be that when it comes to the tuma of the body, that's more stringent. And so as a result, there's another basis to say that it should apply, and that is that it's more strict. So Amar Rav Ashi, Mimai de tumas aguf chamura, Dilma tumas basar chamura. Yeah, you're right that the punishment of tumas aguf is more severe, but there is an aspect of tumas basar that is also more severe, and therefore you're not going to be able to necessarily say that we're just going to apply something that's more stringent. And how is tumas basar more chamor than tumas haguf? Shekain ein la tahara b'mikvah. There's no way to get rid of the tuma of a piece of meat. There's nothing you can do about it. You can't just put it in the mikvah, unlike the tuma of a person, which can be purified and therefore has an aspect that is less stringent, and so therefore you're not going to be able to use the stringency associated with tumas haguf to say that we should therefore apply that prohibition. Even Rabbi Yossi Aglili should apply that prohibition. Even though Rabbi Yossi Aglili agrees that in theory, if you had something that is only more strict and now it applies to something that was less strict, and you have an isser that now would apply to something that was only prohibited with something that was less strict, it would apply. The more stringent thing would apply. But this isn't that case. And so as a result, even though the rabbis say the Isser Kolel now adds to the prohibition, and you have the prohibition of a Tameh person eating a Tameh piece of even a Tameh piece of meat, of a korban, Rabbi Yossi Aglili continues to say that if the piece of meat became Tameh before the person, we're not going to add to the prohibition. Okay, so now
Does he want to say that if a tahor person touches or eats the tame meat, that person becomes tame?
no,
Oh,
that's
I
not
didn't
what we're
think
saying.
so.
No. Okay, chomer b'shchita mi ba'aliyah. There's an aspect of slaughtering outside the Beis Hamikdash that is more stringent than offering a sacrifice and bringing and burning a sacrifice outside the Beis Hamikdash. Ubali amibishchita, and there's an aspect of burning a sacrifice outside the Beis Hamikdash that's stricter from the rules associated with slaughtering an animal outside the Beis Hamikdash. Let's tell us what those are. Chomer b'shchita, the stringency associated with slaughtering the animal. Shashochet lahed yot chayiv, if you were to slaughter an animal for somebody to eat, you would be liable. If it was a sacrifice, again, so you take a sacrifice and now you slaughter it so that some regular person could eat it outside the Beis Hamikdash, you're still liable for slaughtering a sacrifice outside the Beis Hamikdash. As Rashi says, Hashoches kachim b'chutz la'achilas hedyot chayiv, for the eating of the person who's a regular person. The hamala lahedyot pater. Whereas if you were to offer up the sacrifice, and Rashi explains the hamala lahedyot pater mishum ha'alolos. If you were to offer it up as a sacrifice to the person, meaning treating the person like an idol. V'chayiv mishum, as Rashi tells us, the next words in the Rashi, v'chayiv mishum avodas kochavim, you would be liable for worshiping an idol. V'im hazid ba'avodas kochavim v'shagag b'ha'alas chutz, and if you did it intentionally with respect to the idolatry, but accidentally with respect to offering a sacrifice outside the Beis Hamikdash, Einu mevi al shigaso chatas. You wouldn't bring based on your accidental or unintentional, not unintentional, but forgetful thing. You wouldn't bring a sin offering. The time of Mefarish b'Gemara, and we're going to explain the reasoning in the Gemara. Okay, and so that's how slaughtering is more strict. Chomer ba'aliyah, the stringency with respect to offering a sacrifice outside. Shnayim she'achulzu b'chsakin v'shachatu peturin. If two people hold the knife and use the knife jointly to slaughter the animal outside the Beis Hamikdash, they're not liable. Each of them, it's a one-person job. But if two people were to hold on to a limb together, they would be liable. As Rashi tells us, shnaim she'achsu b'Gemara mefarish la. We're going to explain this in the Gemara. Okay, so next rule, hala v'chazer v'hala v'chazer v'hala. If you offer it up and then you offer it again and then you offer it again, chayiv al kol aliyah. You're liable for each bringing. Divri Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Rabbi Yossi says, Eino chayav ela achas. You're only chayav once. So why are you chayav multiple times? Rashi adds in a word, hala v'nodalo v'chazar v'hala. If you forgot that you're not allowed to offer sacrifices outside, and then you offered it, and then you realize and you're told, hey, you're not allowed to do that, and then you forgot again and you brought a new one. Mi osa behema, from that same animal, Rashi tells us, atzma, b'gemara mefarish pluktayu, and the Gemara is going to explain the argument. But the bottom line is that we seem to see that according to Rabbi Yossi, even if you have multiple instances of lack of knowledge, you're going to be only liable once. Ve'enu chayav ad sheyalo l'rosh hamizbeach. And you're also only liable if you bring it to the top of the altar. Rabbi Shimon Omer, afilu hela al sela o al ha'even chayiv. No, you don't. It doesn't have to be a formal altar. It could be any kind of rock or stone, and that's going to result in liability. So ma'ishna ha'mahalala hedjut pater. Why is it that that if you offer up a sacrifice to a regular person, you're going to be exempt? Diksiv lahashem, because the Torah says lahashem in connection with the prohibition of offering sacrifices outside the Beis Hamikdash. B'shchita nami haksiv Hashem. But one second, if that's true, if you were to slaughter the animal outside the Beis Hamikdash, you should also not be liable because it also says Lashem in connection with that. Shiny Hasam, no, but that's different. The Amar Kra Ish Ish. The pasuk says, this is a pasuk. This is Vayikra Perek Yud Zayin pasuk Gimel, which says Ish Ish mi Beis Yisrael Asher Yishchat Shor O Kesef O Eiz b'Machaneh O Asher Yishchat Michutz LaMachaneh. Right, we're basically again highlighting that this pasuk is telling us about slaughtering outside the Beis Hamikdash because you slaughtered it in the camp or even outside the camp, and by repeating Ish Ish, it suggests that there are two cases, that even a case where you were to slaughter it for another person. So ish asher shochet leish, essentially. And so as a result, that's why a shchita is different because that pasuk is talking about shchita. But gabi ha'ala namiksiv ish ish. You were using this concept of ish ish, but that same ish ish, there's another verse specifically Vayikra Perek Yud Zayin Pasuk Chet that also has the language of Ish Ish. Indeed, the pasuk is V'aleihem Tomar Ish Ish Mi Beis Yisrael Umin Hager Asher Yagur B'Socham Asher Ya'aleh Olah O Zevach. So that pasuk is talking about the actually offering of the sacrifice outside the Beis Hamikdash, and so as a result, it's got to be that you there too. Maybe you should say that even if you offer it in honor of a person, you're going to, to a person, you're going to be liable. No, mi boile lishnayim shehelu be'ever chayavim. No, that ish is telling us the rule about two people sacrificing a sacrifice together. That they're going to be liable if they bring a limb, if each of them holds part of the limb, and they put the limb up on the altar and burn it. Well, ihachi nami. One second, though. We just said in our Mishnah that if two people grab the knife together, they're not going to be liable, but we should use the ish ish that talks about shchita to say that they are liable. No, shiny hasam de amar kra hahu echad velo shnayim. So not only do we have ish ish when it comes to shchita, we have the word hahu, right? And it says, where's the word hahu? The word hahu is in Perek Yud Zayin Pasuk Dalid, where it talks about the person being cut off from the Jewish people and getting the punishment of kares. Because it says the El Pesach Oel Moed Lo Hevio Lahakriv Korban LaHashem Lifnei Mishkan Hashem Dam Yechashev LaIsh Hahu Dam Shafach Nichras V'Nichras Ha'ish Hahu Mikerev Amo. So again, Ha'ish Hahu. So we have the Hahu there to say that it's limiting, and so as a result, we're not going to we're going to say that the hahu means echad v'lo shnayim because it's singular. Well, ihachi gabi ha'ala nami ksiv hahu. Well, one second, in connection with again showing that the psukim are consistent between shchita and ha'ala. With it comes to ha'ala, it also says hahu, and that's in pasuk tet of Vayikra, Perek Yud Zayin. And so as a result, where it says, Ve'el Pesach Ohel Moed, Lo Yevienu, La Sozo So La Hashem, V'nichras Ha'ish, Hahu Meyamav. So, Miboile, no, that Hahu we need for a different purpose as we turn to Kuf Chet Amud Bet. L'ma'ute shogeg anus umut'ah. That if somebody makes a mistake or is coerced or has been misled, they're not going to be liable for offering up a sacrifice outside. Well, ihachi hachi nami miboy l'mute Anus shogeg umuta. So let's do the same thing. Right now, at this point, the same words are used with respect to both slaughtering and and bringing up. And so as a result, whether you're slaughtering or bringing up, the same rules should apply. And now we get to our final answer. Trey hahuksiv. No, when it comes to the slaughtering, it says hahu twice, as we saw in the pasuk that we cited earlier. That it says, it says in pasuk Dalid, "Vel pesach ol moed lo hevi la'akriv korban la'Hashem lifnei mishkan Hashem dam yechashev le'ish hahu." Number one, dam shafach v'nichras ha'ish hahu mikerav amo. So that person who spilled the blood because we're talking about somebody who slaughtered, that's got two hahus. It's got two limitations. And so one limitation is is to tell us that the person, if they has to act alone, and if there are two people holding the knife, that won't create liability. And the other one tells us that you're not going to be subject to liability if you make a mistake or you're coerced or you've been misled. And so that limitation applies to both ha'ala and shchita. But the limitation about two people together, that only applies to shchita and not to ha'ala. Ve'ela la'Hashem lamali. So why do I need the la'Hashem? Lo tzi se'ir hamishtalech. It's in order to tell us that the se'ir hamishtalech, that when you send the goat out to Azazel, that is not going to be subject to the prohibition of slaughtering an animal outside the Beis Hamikdash, slaughtering a sanctified animal outside the Beis Hamikdash. So if you were to go and take that animal and slaughter it outside the Beis Hamikdash because it was not LaHashem, therefore it's not going to be you're not going to be liable. But the bottom line is that we have these limitations, and so the limitation of hahu not only tells us, it also tells us that in fact you need to that when it comes to LaHashem. So in second, so when it comes to LaHashem, you need to the LaHashem of slaughtering is about the goat to Azazel, whereas the LaHashem of offering is telling us that if you offer it as a sacrifice to a person, well, then you're not going to be liable. So the LaHashem in those two contexts teach us different things. Okay. So
what does it mean to offer as a sacrifice to a person? You're sacrificing normally
like to a king, for example, if you say that you're sacrificing it to the king as if the king was an idol, that's what we're talking about.
So that's avodah zarah, isn't it?
Yes, yes, that's what we said when we were learning the Mishnah together. The Rashi makes it explicit that we're talking about a case of avodah zarah.
Well, I'm a little confused. Why are we even discussing two people? Normally, if you bring a korban, or a korban or any type of korban, there's a kapara to one person, right? It's not. We can't even. Why would two people even be involved in bringing any shchita, any korban? It's usually for one person. He gives it a kohen. It's his shaliach, okay, but I mean,
but the act, even if one person, you're right, one person may be the owner of the animal. But the liability is about the actual actions of the offering. And so there are limbs that are very heavy of the animal. And so those limbs require two people to bring it up to the top of the altar. And so those two people who put that limb on the top of the altar that's outside the Beis Hamikdash are going to both be liable for bringing a sacrifice, for doing ha'ala outside the Beis Hamikdash. The point isn't about who owns the sacrifice. You're making a very good point that there might be one owner of the sacrifice. We're dealing with the prohibition of actually burning a sacrifice outside of the Beis Hamikdash. And that action could involve multiple people, irrespective of who the owner is. The owner doesn't make a difference. The identity of who owns the animal that is being put on the altar outside the Beis Hamikdash is not what's triggering liability. In fact, the odd thing of what
He
you're
might not even be
highlighting.
liable then if he doesn't touch the
Yes, that's
animal.
exactly right. That's exactly what I was about to say, is that you're highlighting that if, John Doe goes to, Kohen Doe and Kohen Joe, and the two Kohens, say, hey, you don't need to go to the base of Migdash. You can offer we have sacrifice in, Tel Aviv. It's the Tel Aviv Sacrifice Center. And now Joe goes, John Doe goes to that center and offers their sacrifice. They're not going to be liable because they can get away with it because there's no liability for them because they didn't do anything. They didn't do any of the activities that triggered that brought up the sacrifice. You're exactly right. All
Even
right.
if he donated it, even if he
Yeah, even
paid
if he
for it.
donated it, exactly, 100%. Now, I'm not saying that he's doing a mitzvah, he's doing an avera, but he's not going to be subject to kares and to kares. All right, chomer b'hala. We said in our Mishnah that there's a stringency associated with offering because again, if two people do it together, they're going to be liable, which is not true for shechita. Tanu Rabbanan ish ish. So we have ish ish ma talmud lomer. So we're just going to cite a brayso that teaches us a lot of the things that we just saw. Ma talmud lomer. What does that teach us? L'rabu shnaim she'achasu be'ever ve'elu shnechayvim. It teaches that two people holding that limb together that offer it up are going to be liable. Sheyachova halo dinu, because I could have said the exact opposite. Ma hashochet lehedyot shechayev. When it comes to slaughtering for a regular person that you're going to be chayev, meaning if you're slaughter a kodesh animal in order for the person to eat the animal, you're still liable for slaughtering a kodesh animal outside the base hamikdash. Shnayim she'achazu b'sakin v'shachatu b'turin, and yet if two people hold the knife together, you're not going to be liable. So hamal lahedjut shepater, when it comes, you could think that there's a kal v'chomer, because after all, if you bring the sacrifice up for a as an idol, to as an idolatrous offering to a person, you're not liable. So eno din shishnayim she'achazu paturin. Well, then certainly, given that leniency that exists with respect to offering to ha'ala, I would think that if two people did ha'ala, you would not be liable. So Talmud Lomer ish ish. That's why it needs to say ish ish. Dibri Rabbi Shimon. That's what Rabbi Shimon says, and that's what we saw a few moments ago. When the Gemara was discussing the earlier part of the Mishnah. Rabbi Yossi Omer hahu. Rabbi Yossi says no, it's hahu. Echad v'lo shnayim. We say that you need one person, but not two people. Of course, that was the rule associated with shchita. And so, im kain, Rabbi Yossi says no. Again, right, this is who we had in our Mishnah. Rabbi Yossi says that you need that two people who work together are not going to be liable. One second, did we have that in the Mishnah? Maybe we didn't. Maybe this is a new opinion. Yeah, we did not have this opinion, but now we're learning that Rabbi Yossi also agrees on this front. That in fact, if two people were to offer a limb together, they would not be liable. So im kain matam olomer ishish. Why does it say ishish? Dibra Torah bilshon b'nei adam. No, that's just the way the Torah speaks. Sometimes it will repeat words, meaning ish can mean everybody. And that's just the way people speak. For Rabbi Shimon, hi hahu mi baile lemeute shogeg anasumuta. And again, Rabbi Shimon would say, why do we need that hahu? We need that hahu to tell us that one who has been forced or makes a mistake or misled, and then offers the sacrifice outside is not going to be liable. For Rabbi Yossi, ma me hahu. And Rabbi Yossi says, no, you can learn that in addition. We can learn two things from hahu. We can learn that only one person is liable for offering a limb and two people working together would not be. And from the fact that it says hahu and not just who, we can say that we also learn that it's one who's mistaken or coerced or misled is not going to be liable. And Rabbi Shimon, hu hahu lo darish. Rabbi Shimon just says you can't just learn something from that extra hay. Rabbi Yossi midahai ish dibra Torah kilshon b'nei Adam, hahu ish ish nami dibra Torah kilshon b'nei Adam. Well, 1 second, if you're going to tell me that ish ish is the way people speak, well, then the ish ish with respect to slaughtering would also be how people speak. And we use that to tell us the Ela Hashokas Lahedros Minalai Dechayev. And we use that to teach us that when it comes to a person slaughtering for another person to eat it, that you would be liable. So Nafgala Midam Yechashev Laish Hahu Dam Shafach. Because it says Laish, that suggests that not only is it referring to the person who actually spilled the blood, but even in a situation where the blood was spilled for a person, even somebody where the shechita is for the person. Okay, so the next part of our Mishnah is hella v'chazav hella, right? If you offer it over and over again, Rabbi Shimon says you're liable for each time, and Rabbi Yossi says you're liable only once. Amaresh Lakish. So four different explanations for this machlokas. Machlokas b'dalad v'hei avarim. Our machlokas is actually about 4 or 5 limbs from one sacrifice. Demar savar kiksiv la'asot oto. When it says oto, what does it mean? Al hashalem. It means the entire animal. Hu chayev ve'enu chayev ala chaser. And you're not chayev for something that's missing. Namely, you're not chayev for a partial offering of just limbs. So aval behema ksiv, akol behema ksiv, because it's referring to the entire animal. Mar savar akol aver ve'aver ksiv. No, the other Rabbi Shimon says you're liable for each one because each limb itself is sufficient. Aval aver achad, when it comes to one limb, divrei akol einu chayev ela achas. If you do one limb, even if you do it in parts, you'll only be liable once. Everybody agrees. For Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Rabbi Yochanan says, no, that's not the machlokus. Machlokus be'ever echad. The machlokus is all about one limb. Demar savar mukatrei penim shechasru. When it comes to something that's burned from within, that's not complete, meaning it's less than a kazayas ve'ela b'chutz chayiv, less than that anything that's an amount that could be burned within, and you now burn it outside, you're going to be liable. Umar savar pater, and the other opinion says that you're not. Aval bedalad vehei evarim divrei kol chayav al kol aver ve'aver. But everybody agrees that when it comes to 4 or 5 limbs, that you would be liable for each and every limb. It's only just when you're dealing with an incomplete limb that's where you're going to be that's where the machlokas is going to be. And a third opinion, upliga de Ula, and Ula has a different opinion. De Amar Ula kol modim, everybody agrees, namely Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yossi. D'mukterei penim shechasru v'helu b'chutz shechayev. Everybody agrees that when it comes to something that was slaughtered inside the Beis Hamikdash and then was brought outside the Beis Hamikdash, that even if it's a partial thing, you would be liable. Lo nechleku el b'mekutre b'chutz, something that needed to be burned outside, meaning that it was slaughtered outside. Shechasru and therefore didn't have a kazayas v'helu b'chutz, and it was then offered outside. Demar savar pater umar savar chayer. That Rabbi Yossi says that you're not liable for offering an incomplete limb of sacrifices that were slaughtered outside the Beis Hamikdash. Umar savar chayer, and the other opinion says that you are liable. And ikadamri, there are those who say that Ula said the following. Amar Ula kol modim b'mukterei chutz shechasru ve'elu b'chutz shehu pator. Everybody agrees that when it comes to sacrifices that are supposed to be burned outside because they were slaughtered outside, that if you offer them incomplete, that you're not going to be liable. Lo nechleku el b'mukterei fenim shechasru ve'elu b'chutz. Only they're arguing only with respect to something that was slaughtered inside the Beis Hamikdash and now is incomplete and that incomplete piece is being offered outside the Beis Hamikdash. That according to Rabbi Yossi, you're going to be exempt, and Umar Savar Chayev, and the other opinion says Rabbi Shimon says that you're going to be liable. And so this is basically the Ula would then agree with Rabbi Yochanan that the Mishnah deals with a limb from an animal slaughtered inside the Beis Hamikdash, which was offered up outside in pieces. Upligi de Avua de Shmuel alishna kama de Ula. And the father of Shmuel disagrees with the first opinion of a Shmuel. De Amar Avua de Shmuel. The first opinion of Ula. The Amar Avua de Shmuel. Keman mahadrinan pokin legabe mizbeach. According to whom do we say that we have to put back pieces of a sacrifice that come off of the altar onto the altar. Kiman delo Rabbi Yossi. It's not like Rabbi Yossi. And according to the first version of Ula, even Rabbi Yossi would hold that pieces, small pieces that burst from the altar, are returned to the altar, and so therefore, and that's why they're chayiv if you bring them outside the Beis Hamikdash. So as a result, this statement of Shmuel's father is in conflict with the statement of Ula. Okay, the Mishnah then continued, "Ve'enu chayiv ad sheya'aleh." You're not going to be liable until you offer up. The Tanakama says you have to offer it on an altar. And Rabbi Shimon says no, even a rock or a stone is sufficient. Amar Rav Huna explains, my time of the Rabbi Yossi, why does he say that you need to have an altar? Diksiv vayiven Noach mizbeach la Hashem. It says Noach built an altar for Hashem. And so as a result, you need to have an altar, whereas Rabbi Yochanan, my time of the Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yochanan says, what's the reasoning of Rabbi Shimon? Diksiv vayikach Manoach es gedi ha'ezim es hamincha vayal al hatzur la Hashem. In the story where Manoach is told that he is going to have a son, what's his name? Shimshon, that he's going to have Shimshon as his son. So he then offers a sacrifice to Hashem, and that sacrifice is offered on a rock. V'idach nami v'aksiv vayiven mizbeach laHashem. One second, how does Rabbi Shimon deal with the fact that Noah built an altar? Hahu govha ba'alma. Nah, that was just in order to have a nice height on which to do the sacrifice. V'idach nami haksiv vayikach Manoach. Well, what about Manoach on the rock? So, Horasha Haisa, that was just a unique moment of teaching at that particular time, and was not telling us in general that a rock is sufficient.
We're saying a rock is like a mizbeach then?
Well, that was the machlokas that we had in our Mishnah, right? So our Mishnah said that Rabbi Shimon says that you're liable even if you use a rock as an altar, and Rabbi Yossi said no, you need to use the entire. You need to actually have a formal altar. That was the machlokas that we had in our Mishnah, and so we're explaining those two opinions. Hainu taima de Rabbi Shimon. And if you want, you could say the following is Rabbi Shimon's explanation, Kidatanya, like we have in the following brisa. Rabbi Shimon Omer Mizbeach Pesach Oel Moed. It says that the altar is at the entrance of the tent of meeting. Ve'ein Mizbeach Bavama. But there is no need for an altar when we have a bama. Lefikach hela al hasela o al ha'even chayab. Therefore, if you offer a sacrifice outside the Beis Hamikdash when you're not allowed to, and you do it on a rock or a stone, because a bama would be permitted to be done that way, you are going to be liable. Yatsa mi baile. 1 second. Here he's saying, 1 second. Here we're not talking about the context of this brisa is to suggest when we're dealing with a situation where bama are permitted. So it should say that you fulfilled your obligation if you offer it on a rock or a stone. No, hachikamar, lefikach b'shas iser habamos hela alasela o aleven chayav. So actually, when I explained the brisa the first time, I gave this additional interpretation that what the brisa is really saying is that when we're in a time that bamot are prohibited, so then because if you did it at the time when bamot are permitted, a rock or a stone would be permitted as a base for the altar, as sort of serving as your altar. Therefore, a rock or a stone that you use to offer a sacrifice outside the Beis Hamikdash when bamot are prohibited is going to result in liability.
But at the time when they're permitted, it would not be, the person would not be liable, right?
Yes, you would be fulfilling your obligation according to Rabbi Shimon. So by Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rabbi Chanina, asked the question, Keren v'kevesh v'yisod v'riboa. When it comes to the horns of the altar, the ramp of the altar, the base, and the square shape, Maushi Akvu Bavama, are all of those necessary with respect to a bama? So Amarle Rabbi Yirmiyah, Tanya, we have a brisa, Keren v'kevesh v'ribua v'yisod, ma'akvin b'vama gedola v'ein b'makvin b'vama katana. That when it comes to the major bamot, and that's a reference to Nov and Givon, and then certainly when we had altars in Shiloh and the Beis Hamikdash, then it's required. But when we're talking about minor bamot, namely the personal bamot, then it is not necessary. And so with that, that brings us to the next Mishnah, and so we'll, God willing, pick up from there tomorrow. Looking forward to continuing our learning together. Tomorrow will be same time, 7:45. I will try and finish a little early so that people can get to Shacharit at at a reasonable time. Have a wonderful day.
How is it the
Yashikov.
Rotia, what's your question?
one
Sir?
question?
Please.
If it's back to the inyan of the atam mishu tame the ochel
Uh-huh.
tame, right?
Okay.
So if he's if a person is tahor and and um he's not allowed to eat tame food, but he doesn't become tame, right? But
Correct.
okay,
Correct.
so but nonetheless, uh, what do we say?
Well,
And if
there
he's
could be
tame,
exceptions if you it depends. If for example, when it comes to Nevelis oath, right? We saw that of a kosher animal, then if you swallow it, you can become
right, if you
tummy. But
swallow it,
but we're gonna I'm assuming we're dealing with a big animal and we're dealing with a non kosher a kosher sacrifice, which is the context of what we're talking about. And that in
so
that context, I believe that you're right that in general you're not going to become tameh.
if he does not become tame, then what is the din there? That whole
No,
the
that's the specific din of well
is he
that
chayav? What is he chayav? Koreit, is he chayav or not chayav? But we were talking about that, right?
right. So that's my understanding of the machlokas, right? So that's let's find it.
And on the other hand, if he is if he's tamei and the meat is tahor, the meat becomes tamei.
Correct. Correct. But that in that situation, he's certainly going to be chayiv kares. That's exactly what the main prohibition is in the Torah that's associated with it. Um, uh,
So there could be if let's see if he's so there could never be as Dove said the other
the end
day.
of the Mishnah specifically says that a Torah person who eats tameh is putter, meaning he's not liable for a chatas. There is an avera, but he's not going to be liable for kares or uh, because he's liable for malchus because he violated a negative commandment, which prohibits the consumption of kudshim that is tameh, because
Right,
that's supposed to get burned. But he's not going, as long as he's tahor, he's not going to be liable. The key question is if he is tameh, what
right,
is the rule? So we have, if he is tameh and the food is tahor, everybody agrees there is going to be kares. If he is tahor and the food is tameh, everybody agrees putter on mechatas, liable for a violation of the Torah, and will be subject to malchus, assuming he's gotten
malchus,
warning, etc.
malchus.
The machlokes is about where he is tameh and the food is tameh. In that situation, according to the chachamim, you would say you're liable for you're going to have you're subject to kares and you're therefore liable for a chatas because it's an iser kolel, and therefore the when the person became tameh, an extra prohibition fell on this piece of tameh kodesh. And according to the alternative position, you would not be, again, according to, I think it was Rabbi Yossi Aglili, according to the other opinion, you would not be liable because because he holds that it is not an Isser Kolel because you are, because we're going to say Ein Isser Chal al Isser in this particular instance.
Now, what Dove was learning the other day, he said there could never be a situation where a tamei person couldn't be chayav because even if the food was tahor, the second he touches it, the food becomes tamei.
No,
No, no. If he's a tamei person, if he's
if he's a
tamei,
tummy person, he's chayav kares.
right?
He's
But
always going to be chayav kares. So I'm
so
confused.
no. But if he were to eat a piece of meat that's tahor,
Yes.
that piece of meat automatically becomes tamei.
Yes, but that's not triggering the additional liability. The biggest liability is for him being tamei and eating a piece of kodesh.
Right, but what he was saying, yes, the 2 days ago was that the second he touches that,
That
that
is true,
becomes tamei, and
but
therefore
that doesn't matter. That isn't what for example, if I were to shove, God forbid, a piece of kodesh into somebody's mouth and they never touch it with the rest of their body, that piece of meat would not actually technically become tamei. So it is theoretically possible to to be tamei and to eat a piece of tahor meat and not have that piece of meat become tamei. But it doesn't matter because whether that piece of meat is tamei or not, acco- um, uh, um, according to everybody, if the only reason that it became tamei is through touching the person who was tamei, who was eating it, everybody still agrees that that case is a case of kares.
right, because
Because he was tamei first. Everybody agrees if the person was tamei first and then eats a piece of kodesh, that he's going to get kares and therefore is going to be subject to a chatas. And so it doesn't matter whether or not the piece of meat became tamei as a result of his touching it and eating it. Let's say it did, great. He's still subject to kares and the chatas. And if he
but
didn't because somebody shoved it down his throat, doesn't matter. Still subject to the kares and the chatas.
but if he ate a piece of meat tamei, right? Isn't he?
If
Isn't he? Is if the meat was already he's tamei, the meat's tamei, and he eats it, isn't he chayiv?
kares, that's the machlokes. So according to the chachamim, he's chayiv kares. You're absolutely right. But according to the alternative opinion, he's not chayiv kares because he's not chayiv kares because it's the iser already existed on the piece of tamei meat. And so as a result, it was already prohibited before he became Tameh. And so as a result, based on the principle of Ein Isser, Halal Isser, we're not going to, there's no extra prohibition that applies to it.
But we don't know if the meat was tamei before he touched it.
We're
Before he
assuming,
ate
we're
it, we
assuming.
don't know. I mean, he's
Hashem
tamei.
knows. So Hashem knows whether it is. And if in fact that was the question of if in fact we were to paskin like the viewpoint that the order matters, well then you would be subject to an asham taloi. That we have a special sacrifice that tells you what you have to do if you're not sure whether or not you're chayiv achatas.
Okay, so that's the case. One is not sure what the order is.
Correct, exactly. If you weren't sure what the order is, we have a specific case, thing that you're supposed to do in that
So,
situation.
but if he is tamei first, you
If
were
he's
saying
tamei first,
it doesn't.
everybody agrees. If he's tamei first, everybody agrees
But
that you're going to be liable and you're going to be subject to kares. And again, it's only Rabbi Yossi Aglili who disagrees. I don't even think we paskin like Rabbi Yossi Aglili.
even
So
if but we say that if he's tamei first, tamei, then the meat is tahor,
he's
he's
subject to kares and chatas.
and if the meat is tamei, he's subject to he's also subject to karet, right?
No, no, well, it depends. Is he tam? You have to tell me the full case. Is he
Well, he's
tamei or
tame
not?
first, and then the meat becomes tame.
So then, yes, he's subject to kares. Correct. If he's tamei, if both of them are tamei, he's subject to, and he's tamei first for sure. He's subject to kares. Everybody agrees. The only machlokes is if he's tamei second, and
Okay, so
everybody
that's
agrees. Again, if he's not tamei at all, everybody agrees that it's just a violation of the Torah, and he's subject to malchus.
but if he's tame and the food is tahor,
Then
he's
it says he's subject to kares.
and if right, okay, and if the meat is he's tame and the meat is tame,
So then, if he was
isn't he
tamei
subject to
first.
karet?
If he's tummy first, then everybody agrees he's subject to kares. And if he was tummy second, we have the machlokes. The chachamim say he's subject to kares no matter what, and the Rabbi Yossi Aglili says no. Only if he was tummy first is he subject to kares and chatas.
So the point that Dove was making the other day is if he's tameh and the meat is tahor, it doesn't make a difference. That's what Dove was saying, because the second he comes close to that meat, touch the meat becomes tameh. So it's as if the meat is tameh.
Yes, for most practical cases, you're right. It's as if the meat was tameh, but the meat becomes tameh second, so everybody agrees that he's subject to kares. So who cares? Meaning it doesn't make a difference once he's tameh. If there's a tahor piece of meat and now he takes that, or somebody else makes it tameh, it doesn't make a difference. If he was already tameh, so that eating that piece of meat, whether it's tahor or tameh, is going to result in kares. So you're right that it doesn't make a difference, but from a technical perspective, I don't believe that Dove was correct because technically, if I were to shove a piece of meat at the person's request, obviously, shove a piece of meat into the person's mouth so that his hands never touch it and his outside of his body never touches the piece of meat, and I put it into his throat so that, again, at his request, so that because he doesn't want the meat to become tameh, and he swallows it and he's tameh, he's subject to kares, and that piece of meat would never have become tameh because he never touched it. So it is theoretically possible. The Gemara discusses that situation in various cases,
Right.
but the bottom line is from a practical perspective, Dove is of course correct that from a practical perspective, whatever happens, if he became tameh first, it's going to be subject to kares, and from a practical perspective, the piece is also going to be tameh. All right. We'll
Right.
pick up,
And
God
then that,
willing,
right.
with the Mishnah on the top of Kuf Tet, God willing, tomorrow. Looking forward to continuing our learning together.